Doing recording. And people are joining, and we're expecting quite a few more, but it's going to take a little bit of time. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here with us today for our workshop on strategies for successful interviews. We really appreciate all of you. And I know that even more are going to be joining over the next couple of minutes. While we're waiting for people to continue to join, we're going to go ahead and start with a warm-up chat while people are joining. So our warm-up chat is, what is one thing that you do to prepare yourself for an interview? Everyone is welcome to just start typing in the chat if you're able to before we get started here. Please feel free to enter in the chat your thoughts. What is something that you do to prepare yourself for an interview? And mock interviews, looking at the organization's goals and values, get a good night's sleep, research the company, find out a lot more. These are all great steps. Everyone else is welcome to enter their thoughts as well. We're so glad you're here. And I am going to thinking up interview questions and prepare your answers. Yep. Find out more about the position. Wonderful. Wonderful. So we are really delighted to have with us here today our speaker, Dr. Bethany Hopkins, and you'll hear more about her in just a second. Thank you. Finding people to talk to from that company. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to have a couple polls. We're going to hear more from Bethany. I'll give you a little bit of the expectations, and then we'll start the workshop. So let's go ahead, rehearsing and finding, these are all, thank you all. Please feel free to continue entering your thoughts about steps that you take to prepare for an interview for a position. Expectations, it's going to be somewhat interactive, so please do feel free to enter things in the chat. And we are recording this with the intent of sharing the recording afterwards. We do have some questions for you. So let's go ahead and let's go ahead and invite everyone to share a little bit about who you are. Which of these describes you? Are you a grad student, an undergrad, a postdoctoral researcher, a professor, a scientist or researcher, a science enthusiast, an educator or teacher or instructor, or none of these? Which of these might describe who you are right now? So we've got we know who registered, but we also know that not everybody who registers can actually attend workshops. So who would you say you are? I'm going to give you 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, and 1. And so it looks like we've got a broad variety. We've got a lot of grad students and postdocs. We also have a number of undergraduate students and quite a few scientists or researchers, and a few who are scientist enthusiasts or educators. So that's our first poll. Let's go ahead and let's also ask you, we've got a couple of questions here. There's 3, but they're really short answer. So have you interviewed for a position in the last 6 months? Do you have an upcoming interview in the future yourself? Have you ever been on the other side? Are you somebody who has the experience of being interviewing a person? And we'll give you all about 5 more seconds to finish answering. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Thank you all so much. So as you can see here, the majority of you haven't been interviewed in the past 6 months, but some of you have. In terms of, do you have an upcoming interview in the future, or all over the place? Kind of a lot of yeses, maybes, and nos. And then, have you ever interviewed somebody 23% of you have interviewed somebody before, but most of you haven't. So thank you all for participating in that. Let's go ahead and tell you about our speaker today, Dr. Bethany Hopkins. We're really delighted to have her with us here today. She has been helping people navigate career transitions. She's committed to making career journeys supportive, inclusive, and affirming. She manages the Science and Technology Policy Fellows at the California Council on Science and Technology. And she really, really does enjoy helping PhD fellows make the jump to fulfilling careers. So we're really glad to have you with us here today. I will let you share a little bit more about yourself, and let's get started. So let's stop sharing there.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you all for having me. It's really nice to meet you all in this webinar. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing some slides. I know I already got a little bit of an intro, but I'll share a little bit about me and what I do before I get into the topic at hand here. Can you all see the slides here?
It looks great.
Okay, great. Let me make sure I can pull up the chat too, so I can see if people respond. So yeah, a little bit more about me. I really love working with people who have advanced degrees who are seeking jobs and doing professional development. I used to be a university career advisor for graduate students and postdocs. I got my PhD in history, actually, from UC Davis. And as Christine mentioned, I'm the Science Fellows Program Manager at the California Council on Science and Technology. I've been there for the last 3 years. So this is a 1-year science policy fellowship program in Sacramento. We have about 15 fellows a year who don't have any previous policy work experience. We're actually looking for applicants now through the beginning of March. Anyone who's going to have a PhD in a science or engineering field by September of this year can apply. And it's a program where people are making a career transition and they have to interview for this fellowship program. And part of working on this program means that I have either conducted or supported a selection committee in conducting a lot of interviews of people from scientific backgrounds. So I've seen a lot of different interview answers to questions, seen a lot of different things happen in interviews, as well as working with people in career advising. So that's where a little bit of my experience comes from. And it's one of the reasons that I've structured this webinar the way it is, the sort of things that I want to share with you today. So I know we already did the poll questions, so let's go right to a thought experiment. And for the thought experiments, you are welcome to just think on it, and you can also respond to any of it in the chat if you'd like to share. So in this thought experiment, imagine that you have just gotten an email and you have been invited to a phone interview for a job on Monday. Those of you who might have an interview coming up, maybe that's now you. Imagine this. So how do you feel when you get this notification? What's the first thing you do? Is it this thing that you prepare for? Some of you could, these things can do right now. Some of them are things you would do like the night before, like get a good night's sleep. How would you start preparing? What are your thoughts? Like, do you feel excited? Do you feel nervous? Like, what's your first go-to thing? Is it this thing you put in the chat, or is it something else? Think through that. And the reason that we have you think through this, as well as the earlier chat storm that we had, is because it's really helpful to reflect on your responses. Yeah, like, do you feel excited? Do you feel nervous? Do you want to avoid even thinking about it until Sunday night, right? How you feel will probably affect what you do next, right? What strategies you use. And your go-to first thing that you do, that probably is a strategy that is already your strength and you're already doing well. This is great. Make sure you keep doing that. So if there's something that I talk about today that wasn't something that you immediately do, you put it off or you wouldn't even think to do, then that's a strategy you want to think about adding. So adding more strategies can help you improve. And I cannot possibly, I'll say this throughout the webinar, I cannot possibly prepare you for every different, interview in every sector for every type of job, but I can help you think through strategies that you can use for many different types of interviews that you may not be using or using to their fullest strength. So I see people in chat saying, excited, nervous, So maybe a combination of those, working on some logistics, like putting the meeting on your calendar, um, maybe reviewing the job listing, right? Maybe going through like strengths, it says, Googling some potential questions. Okay, so we have a lot of different strategies. This is great. Um, yes, okay. Responding right away. That's great. That's a really important next step there. So think about that. And as we go through today, I hope a few things that you leave with. First, just a better understanding of some different interview strategies, right? I hope that there might be at least one or two that are more memorable examples for you that you can hold on to. And I hope that you have at least maybe one new strategy, approach, thing that you haven't really been doing that you could try out in your next interview. Great. We keep seeing this. More things coming in. Excited and nervous are the most common things I'm seeing here. Um, so I'll try to make sure that I address like a little bit of those feelings as well as I go through here. So let's move on a little bit. I want to start with the purpose of a job interview. And I like doing this as a Venn diagram to remind us. On the employer side here on the left, the employer wants to feel that you are a good fit for the job at the end of that interview. And you, on the other side, want to feel the job is a good fit for you so that both of you feel good and that they make an offer, then you will accept. I find this is helpful to remind you that there's two parts to this. Like, yes, you want to show them that you're a good fit, but you also want to make sure that as you're going through and preparing and doing the interview, that you still feel that this job would be a good fit as well. So I'm talking just a little bit very broadly about some differences between academic and non-academic interviews, and I'll try to have some examples as I go through this. It's really hard to generalize and to address them all in a short webinar, but for universities and academic institutions, and somewhat for research institutes, but there's some differences. I'll talk a little bit about that. A lot of this would be the most true for like a tenure track faculty position interview. You'll see that those interviews might follow more of an academic cycle. So you might be more likely to see it posted in the fall with interviews through the winter and into spring, like a longer timeline that follows the academic year. Um, More often in those interviews, you'll see questions that reflect that your research contributions would be really valued, and that's a high priority. Um, are there people seeing slides? Okay, people are seeing slides. Great. Please let me know if it's not showing up. The other thing is that expertise is usually pretty critical. Like that doesn't mean that other things like collaboration aren't valued or that if it's a faculty position that teaching isn't valued, but that would typically be higher up on a priority list. And you'll see that reflected in interviews. Interviews beyond academia in nonprofits, in the government, and then the private sector, you're going to see a lot more variety in format and timing. Typically, the larger the employer, the slower they move, and smaller employers can move more quickly. And then you just see a lot more variety in formats. More often, you also see that transferable skills can be valued. So those are skills that you can do in many different types of jobs. So that might be skills in writing and speaking and presenting, in critical thinking, in analysis of data, things that are not specific to one area of subject matter expertise. And you'll also see that teamwork is often really critical. Again, it's not that, your research background and these maybe wouldn't be valued. It's just that the teamwork and contributions and working collaboratively in teams would typically be something you see more of in those interviews. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about some strategies. And I saw that some of you already do these, but I'm going to add some more. And then there's one strategy I haven't seen a whole lot of people emphasize that I'm going to emphasize. So we're going to talk about gathering information, preparation, and then a little bit about evaluation at the end here. So let's talk about gathering information. A lot of you mentioned this in what you do to prepare, and I was really happy to see this. You want to find out as much as possible about the logistics of the interview, the audience that interview, as well as the employer and the specific team. You won't find out everything, and that's expected. But I love that some of you put, I would respond to the request for an interview because that's how you can follow up to find more logistics. A lot of you said you would look up more about the company and think about it that way. So those are all ways you would be doing gathering information. Interviews are not a monolith. You want to think about who and what and the format. All of that will shape how you prepare, and that can help you be more successful. So sources of information, obviously reading whatever reputable sources you can to research that employer and that team and anything you need to know about them. And then talking to people who know. This is especially true if you're thinking about moving sectors or moving into a type of job that you have not had before. And in my experience, again, not to make all generalizations, but scientists might be a little bit more hesitant or reluctant, especially if you've worked more in academia, to reach out to someone you don't know well or don't know, and say, I'd like to just have a conversation with you and learn a little bit more about your employer, learn a bit more about this sector, to have that, what we'd call an informational interview in the career development world. So consider doing that one, even if it makes you a little bit uncomfortable. Talking to people, sometimes some of the best information is in people's heads. So don't skip that when you're gathering information. Just wanted to emphasize that. All right. Logistics. So this is just the basics of like how the interview is going to work, the format. You want to gather as much information as you can, and then I'll tell you as we go along how that will affect how you prepare. So some of the kinds of things that you want to know if they don't share this up front, how long is the interview going to be? Preparing for like a 15-minute short phone screening interview with a 30-minute versus an hour or 2 hours, very, very different, right? So how long is it going to be? What is the format and where will it be? Is this a phone interview, a video interview? Is this in person, right? So what is the format? What do you need to know about where it is, especially if it's in person? Anything that you can gather about that. And then a really, really critical one, as much as you can find out about who will be there. Typically, you'll know at least one person, often the person who contacted you, the person who's doing the hiring, but often there's more than one person, not always, but you want to find out who's going to be there, if possible, what are their roles, because you are going to need to tailor your answers to make sure that everybody can understand them, not just the person who is knows the most about what you do and is most similar to you. You need to be able to speak to all of these people. You will also want to find out if there's any materials or any preparation to do in advance. This is a little bit more uncommon for a later stage interview. So is there a presentation? Is there a teaching demonstration? What is something, are there any materials that you need to do to prepare? If you need to know that, then that's a really critical step there. And then you may not always gather this information. They may not always share this, but how many rounds of interviews are there going to be? Is this just a one round interview, two, three more? So helping to kind of shape what you know about how to prepare for the interview. It's just the logistics are something you don't want to skip. And then putting it on your calendar, as was already mentioned, that's a great next step. Your audience is key. Your audience is who's interviewing you and who's going to be there. So we're going to spend a little bit more time. Anything you can learn about the names and titles and their role at that employer and on that team is going to be really helpful. Because if there's one thing you remember from all of this preparation, it's like, how do I think like the interviewer? How do I think like the employer? They will have all this in their head. How can I think like they do? So think through, what do you think they care about? What do you think that an interviewer cares about? Does it is it always the same? Does it change? They're looking for that best fit, but like what are some of the specific things that you think they might care about? So I have a few things here to share on that. So it really depends on what their role is. I did put a little bit about academic jobs here, and then I'll do their kind of analog for jobs outside of the academic jobs. So in an academic job, if you have like a committee, say there's a search or a selection committee, they're all trying to find like a top candidate that they want to recommend for this job. And there's often a search committee chair. That person would want to find the candidate that best meets the needs, typically of the larger group, like the department. And then if there's other colleagues, like other faculty, researchers, they want a good colleague, good coworker, potential collaborator, right? Those people are involved in the interview process. And then if there's any institutional leadership that you would encounter in an like when you're interviewing, they're typically looking to choose a candidate who offers like the best fit to the institution, bigger picture. This is pretty similar if you're looking for jobs outside of academia. You might encounter in a first round what we call a screening interview HR staff or a recruiter. These aren't people you would be working with, but they might be doing the screening. So they might have a job description and the list of questions to ask. So they want to find a strong, eligible candidate to recommend to move forward to talk to the actual person who'd supervise them. And then the hiring manager, that's what we call the person who is doing the hiring, who would supervise you in that role. That person is typically looking to find the best fit, someone that they feel like they could supervise well, who would really add to their team. And then again, the colleagues, if there are colleagues who are involved in the interview process, they want to find a good teammate, somebody who's pleasant to work with. And then for leadership, they're looking to find like a good fit for the mission, the vision, the culture, right? So it could be like, what if it's a, government agency, what service do they provide? What do they regulate? If it is a nonprofit, like what community do they serve? What is their broader purpose, right? That their board of directors cares about. So these are all the kind of things you would talk about if you're talking to someone in a leadership role. So it's helpful to think about if there are different people that you're meeting or there are different people who are part of the interview process, your answers can really be tailored to what do they need to know, what do they most likely care about. A lot of you already talked about this, but I do want to just mention a few things about thinking through what can you gather about the employer. So I would recommend especially if it's an employer you're less familiar with, looking up some things about their recent history so that where have they been in the news, right? If it's an agency, what is their, most recent reports on? If it's a nonprofit, what are do they have a strategic plan or do they have any filings about their funding that you can look at? You want to think about where have they been recently? What have they been doing? Kind of what the foundation is, that employer. And then future outlook, also really important, right? What are the predictions for, what have you seen for this employer looking forward to the future? What are they, is this a startup with a lot of seed funding and they're moving quickly? Is this, a very notable, agency that has, is doing a lot of hiring and has been tasked with a new goal, right? You want to think about what's the future outlook, whatever that is. Any notable changes? There have been a lot of changes at a lot of employers in the last year. And if you are like most people in this group, and it's been more than 6 months since you interviewed, and maybe your knowledge of that employer or about how to interview for those jobs is from a while ago, what has changed at that employer? How is it going there? And then always you want to think about who's in charge, what's the leadership? The leadership always like set the tone and the goals and the mission for that organization. Really helpful to think about all of these things. Try to gather that if you can. Even just a little bit on each of these is fine. You don't have to do like a whole research project on it, but gather this information. And a couple of things too to look into a little further if you're not familiar with them that are not part of that list. Any key terms that come up as you're learning about the employer or in the job description that you don't know, familiarize yourself with those. If possible, if you can find an organization chart, what's called an org chart, to see how, the reporting structure and, who does what at that employer. Not always something you can find, but sometimes you can. And then success metrics, like what would be the measure of success here? Is this a publicly traded company that needs to be profitable? Is this, are you going to be a public servant and you have a specific mission? Is this grant funded and you need to meet those? There's probably something in terms of a success metric for that employer in general that may shape your experience there too. So these are just a few things to think about in terms of like strategies for gathering information that could help you think about what you want to prepare in your answers. Teams, the last one I want to talk about. And this is one where you might already know a little bit depending on who's in the interview, right? If you've learned about who's going to be interviewing you. But anything you can learn, even if they're not going to be in the interview, about other roles on the team, what their place is within the employer, anything about the reporting structure, so who reports to who, and then this is one you can't always find out, but if you can try to learn it through your network, why is this position open? Right? So is this a newly created position? Is this somebody who left the employer or someone who got promoted? Has this position been open because two previous positions were combined into it? So anything you can learn about it can usually be helpful. And this is my last little reminder that especially to find out about the team and the employer, things that you can't just like look up online, ask your network. Ask someone, do you know anyone who works here? Do you know anyone who's had this kind of role? LinkedIn is usually a place that you can start for finding that, but talking to people you know is also a good place to start. Just using that network to gather that information. Can't emphasize it enough. Really, really critical. Um, I will put the last little, I don't have this on the slide, but has anyone ever heard about a job opening that they would not have known about if they hadn't heard about it through their network? Like it wasn't posted somewhere that they would have seen, but they heard about a job opening because somebody told them. Does that apply? Has that ever happened to you? Every one of them? Yeah, yeah. If that's the way you're finding jobs, that's also the way to find out what information you need to know to prepare for them. Yes, a few, versus every one of them from your PhD advisor. Yeah, that it's a useful strategy to think about how can your network help you. Okay, so let's move on to talk about strategies for preparation, which is what I think a lot of people think about when they think about strategies for successful interviews, and that's where we'll spend the most of the time here. So, oh yeah, okay, we're getting more. Yeah, research mentors shared a summer internship role. So important. It's how people find things. It's how they prepare for interviews too. Let's talk about getting ready for interviews, as ready as you can be. You don't necessarily always know what you're going to encounter, but there are ways to be prepared. So I'm going to have you think about how to think like an interviewer, how to practice your answers, and how to anticipate challenges. And the practice your answers, if you take nothing away from this, that's the key. So let's start with thinking like an interviewer. We've already done this a little bit by trying to gather as much information as we can in this preparation stage. But again, like it's helpful if since the majority of folks here, 77%, have not been on the other side. Let's imagine what that's like. Let's do another little thought experiment. Imagine that you are asked to be on an interview panel to help hire a colleague, and it's where you currently work. You know, your boss, your superior, your PI asks you like, "Hey, can you be a part of this interview panel?" So now you're interviewing to help hire another colleague. So think about what that role might be where you work. What is one question you might most want to ask? You get to say you get to ask a question. You get to contribute to the interview questions. You're on the other side now. What's a question you want to ask to help hire a colleague? Does anything come to mind? What do you want to know? Do you want to know about what motivates them? Do you want to know about the specific kind of previous experience? All right, so we have what inspires you to work here? Why are you interested in this role? Yep. What drives them? Yeah. Do you like talking to people? Yeah. How are you with working with other people in the morning? Right? Why do you think you fit? What is your main goal? have they worked outside of academia? Okay, so you all have lots of thoughts on if you had to do this. So you immediately had some thought there. And could you answer your own question? Like right now, could you answer the question that you want to ask? Because if you have put yourself in the shoes of an interviewer, it really helps you to think about like what is behind that person's question, what motivates them, what they're most interested in hearing about. So this is a helpful thought experiment if you've never been in this position, and you can keep this in mind as you are looking at the job description and thinking about how to prepare. So many of you mentioned that you might review a little bit to think through what questions you have, right? Um, so how many of you thought about reviewing the wish list? It's like, this is what we would really most ideally want in this person. And there's a structure to them most of the time that can help you think about what they may ask you in an interview. So you'll typically have an employer and team description. So how is that described? Look through that as well as what you find online. There's typically a description of the work or like what this person will do. Sometimes there's even like a percentage breakdown, bullet points. So that tells you what you would need to be able to do well. And then there's typically a breakdown of like what makes someone eligible for this role, qualified for this role, into required and preferred qualifications. So required qualifications most generally go from like the most important, critical ones to things that are nice to have, but maybe not as often used or not quite as critical as the top ones. They're still important, but top to bottom, what's most important there? And then the preferred qualifications are often like really nice extras to have. Maybe you won't have all of them, but if you do, that can be a way you think about including that in your answers so that you can stand out because it's not one of the required qualifications. So I would definitely recommend if you have an interview to go back and think, okay, these interviewers are going to be looking at the job description. They're going to be thinking about me as a person, but they're also going to be thinking about how do I make sure that this person has what we need. And so I would recommend comparing that to your own CV or resume and being honest, like, okay, as I prepare for the interview, here are these strengths that I have that I want to make sure that I highlight. I'll come up with, answers to questions that I can highlight those strengths. And then I'll also prepare for the areas I think might be more challenging for me to talk to about. The things where I have less experience or things where it might just be like less straightforward to talk about. So let me include a little bit. I'm including this as an example. It's sometimes just more helpful to have an actual job description. This is an old, not a current postdoc position from JPL. And I didn't have space to include the employer or team description, but I am going to highlight to you the rest of it. So this one it's a postdoc, and the selected postdoc will focus on the following. Those bullet points are all descriptions of what that postdoc would do. And then the required qualifications are below that, and then the preferred qualifications below that. So hypothetically, if you were somebody looking at this, you could go through and say, okay, I know these are the areas where I have strengths and I want to talk about them, where I can to highlight, my experience with mineral chemistry, my collaboration, the PhD that I did in geochemistry, right? My knowledge of lunar science, that's things where I can make sure that I weave that into my answers. And then maybe you think about, okay, I have less experience with some of these required qualifications, like with one of the microbeam analysis in here, like I haven't really used that in a long time, or I don't use that, and I would have to get up to speed on that. Or maybe you haven't had, maybe you had working on a research grant, but it was paused, so you have to prepare for how you'll talk about that. But you have a plan here for at least talking through the things that might be help you kind of be qualified and show them the things that that they're already looking for here, at least the things that are like the critical parts of this role. So I know this is, maybe you can't possibly read all of this when we're here, but just to kind of show you what you could do. You may have already done this as you've applied, but to go back and do that, to say, okay, my answers, my stories that I tell in my responses to interview questions can include these. And then the most critical part of all is to practice your answers. I saw one person mention this, is what would you do? What do you do to prepare? And if you take nothing away, nothing else at all from this webinar, take this. Practice saying answers to interview questions out loud. Say them out loud. Do it more than once. Do it for a friend. Do it in the mirror. You can record it. You can time it. But the important thing is that you practice speaking out loud. This is really, really, really critical. And see how, and like listen to it and see what you could improve or change. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but practice. In my experience as a career advisor, working with like scientists working on their PhDs who would come to me, say, I have a job interview, and they had done a lot of good preparation. And I asked them, have you practiced out loud? Have you said any of your answers? And the answer very often was no. And that would be the first thing we did. So practice out loud. And we'll get to a little bit of about some tips for that, but you get a prep and then you practice. A few things that you'll want to prep so that you can practice. It depends on some common interview types. So first, introductory question, like you're going to get some version of tell us about yourself, why you'd be a fit for this position. And often, as you all have said in the chat, why are you interested in this role? Why do you want to work here? Why do you want to do this? Right? So introductory question. You will probably get some questions about, technical skills and subject matter expertise if that's a focus. And then another common type of interview questions that we'll spend some time on are behavioral. So asking about your past actions, specific examples. You might also have questions on research design or communications and teaching, depending on the type of job. So research design and teaching would be more common, especially if you're interviewing for a tenure track faculty role. Research design would also be important in industry, communications it's just everywhere, but especially outside of academia. So thinking through the information you gathered will help you think about most common interview questions, and you can Google specific ones, but we'll talk about the things that most often trip people up here. And there's two types of answers that you want to do in a story format that you can practice out loud. So the first is an elevator pitch and the second are star stories. An elevator pitch is essentially a tailored version of an elevator pitch to answer that common introductory question. Tell me about yourself and then anything that follows. Tell me about yourself and your research. Tell me about your interest working here, but it's tell us about yourself and the most common first question. So if you are nervous, that's the one to practice the most and practice first. And then star stories, you want to answer their behavioral interview questions with that. So a behavioral question just asks about your past behavior, and you want to practice talking about it with some specific examples in a specific order. And I'll talk a little more about that. The reason that you answer this way is that people recall stories best. And it's that, especially if they ask you for a past example, what you do not want to do is say something kind of general. Like I say, tell me about a past example of you doing X, and you're like, well, in general, I do it this way. Being general is not an answer to the question. And it's really easy to do that if you haven't practiced. So let's go into the details of this. Elevator pitch. So is this something that you can put in the chat? Have you practiced saying out loud different types of introductions to different people, describing who you are, what you do? Is that something that you have done before? Have you done any version of what I'm calling an elevator pitch? Because this is something that's typically pretty short, 30 seconds to 2 minutes. It varies a lot, but it should be something that you have said out loud before so that you can deliver it with confidence. It is a concise, professional intro. It is accessible to whoever your audience is, and it is tailored to the job. It comes from this idea that if you were in an elevator with somebody and they ask, what do you do? You could do a version of your elevator pitch in the time it takes to ride that elevator. But I'm talking about it in a very specific way related to how you're going to answer that first question. If you're like, I just don't even know where to get started on these, I tend to ramble or go off topic, you could try this format where you just make sure that you've included the past, present, and future. So what have you done in the past? What are you doing right now? And then what do you want to do in the future, which is the answer to that one that a lot of you wanted to ask a potential colleague. Why this job? Why do you want to do this? So this is something that gets easier with practice. And it really is your first impression. So you have to make it relevant to your audience and you have to make it conversational. So when I say make it conversational, I mean that it's not the ideal scenario to write it out word for word and read it. I know that can be very tempting, is to have a written version that you just read, especially if it's a phone or video interview. Your interviewers can tell, and it doesn't come across the way that people speak. We speak and we read differently, like the way that we write and the way that we speak, they are different. The one thing is, I understand if English is not your first language, you may want to write down more of it, but I would recommend, as many of you said, writing down bullet points of the main things that you want to convey, and then thinking about how you would change it to make it relevant to your audience. And I will give you an example before we go to this thought experiment that I have here. So there is a fellow in the CCST Science Policy Fellows program that I work on who has a PhD in planetary science. So I've heard him give his introduction to different groups of people. And when he's talking more to researchers, I'm sure, he would introduce, a little bit more about how he, analyzed data with custom R software and identified physical characteristics of near-Earth asteroids. And when he's talking to people in the policy world, he'll say that he studied asteroids with a focus on how to preventing them from hitting the Earth. So it is much different focus and a simpler explanation for what he does, tailors it to different audiences, and that's what we all should be doing. So I would challenge you right now. Again, I'm not assuming that you're applying for something in this field, but if you're used to giving a more academic version of your elevator pitch, what your research is and what you do, how would it change if you were talking to people who work in policy? What would you emphasize that has a broader appeal or has a connection to something that they might have heard of, or that's in the news, or that's just not necessarily something that you would emphasize for a specialist audience, but that might be relevant for that elevator pitch to policy folks? So just something to consider. You can put it in the chat if you want to think about and then share how you would describe that. But this is something that if you haven't gotten used to doing this, practice is going to be the biggest thing. The other thing that takes practice to come up with and then to be comfortable saying are star stories. And this is something you may have heard if you've heard anyone talk about how to prep for interviews. Star stories are for behavioral questions. Employers ask these kind of behavioral interview questions because past behavior is one of the best predictions of future behavior. And this is the format that you can remember and put your bullet points in order of and practice so that you are making sure to answer these kinds of questions the best way. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, result. And these behavioral interview questions are common across the board. So the situation is what situation you're in, the most key context somebody needs to know to follow the story. The task is what is the task at hand. The action is what did you then do? And it needs to be something that's specific to you, not just like, oh, we all were doing this, but like, what was your role? What was your actions? And then finally, the result. What was the outcome? And potentially, what did you learn from it? So situation, task, action, result. And I'll say that if you are having trouble coming up with stories, it's really often best to start with like, where did I get a good result where I took some action? Because those are the things that people most often forget to include, or they pick ones where they don't really have much of a result. So you want to pick some stories from your own experience where you have this. I'm going to list a couple of different common behavioral question topics, behavioral interview question topics for you, because this is something that I know people often look up and want to know. I would say that these first ones, I've got 2 slides of this, are like some of the most common. So collaboration is fairly common. So working with others or working on a team, dealing with conflict. So interpersonal challenges, a difficult person, conflict with a colleague or supervisor or external person, Communication, so examples of you listening and speaking and writing well. Problem solving, just like handling challenges in general. Being resilient, like dealing with failure and learning from mistakes. I've also seen and asked people questions about time management, like how do you handle competing priorities? How do you manage that? Adaptability, how do you respond to change? The change is inevitable. And then this is the one that some of you wanted to ask is like motivation. What motivates you? Why are you interested? What motivates you in the work you do? What are kind of values? Do they align with the values of why the rest of us are doing this? Why this employer exists? And a couple example behavioral interview questions, and then we'll talk through like an example of how you might prepare one. Give an example of when you worked on a team to solve a problem. What was your role? Tell us about a time when you had a conflict with a colleague. How did you handle it? These are the kinds of questions you might get. If you've gotten a behavioral interview question that you remember or one that you've heard of, this is a great time to put it in the chat because I think people really appreciate seeing some specific examples. So what are some example behavioral interview questions that you can recall? Something where they asked you about past action. Give us an example, tell us about a time, anything like that. While you're thinking about it, let's go through and think how we'd prepare for one of these and just in general how to prepare star stories. So your star stories, you want to have several of them, and honestly, ideally at least 5. And this does vary depending on your career stage. So if you are an undergraduate, you may have less, and if you are someone who's like a mid-career person, you may have more. So that's totally fine. You'll have to be ready on the spot to decide which one to use in the moment. But the best thing about preparing these is they can be used to answer multiple questions, right? So if you had a story where you had a conflict with a colleague, but you were also collaborating and you were under deadline pressure, that can answer like 3 different types of behavioral interview questions. So this is a way when you don't know what questions you're going to get to just be prepared for a lot of different ones. If you're comfortable saying these, you will be more prepared for anything they throw at you. You want to pick stories that show multiple good qualities. Make sure they show you in a good light. Do not pick ones where you're like, I don't think this shows myself very well. And then make bullet point lists of key points you want to remember. Again, I recommend this rather than writing it out word for word because we write differently than we speak. And then practice saying them in a natural way. We've got a couple in the chat here. Tell us about a time you encountered a new challenge in your work, something you never run into before. How did you approach it? I love that. Wow, what a question. And then how have you handled conflicting priorities in the past and communicate to those who were impacted? Great. These are both really good examples. Communication, conflict, problem solving, right? These are all examples of like really common types of categories for behavioral interview questions. So let's take one as an example, just like break it down. This is not the full level of detail, but let's say you are answering the question, when you worked on a team to solve a problem, tell us about that time. What was your role? Right? So you would include the situation. My example here is being a PhD student, you're doing research, you're doing collaboration. There's 3 different labs globally who are working on this research. You had a task, because this is team focused, it's more about the team task of coordinating with all of them so that you could submit research for publication. The actions that you took, you have your bullet points to remember how you set up milestones, you led these meetings across time zones, you checked in when one lab was behind schedule and you hadn't heard from them. And then the result, you got everyone to communicate and you were able in the end to submit research for publication. And you really thought about this one first. You thought about something that had a result where you took some actions and you get comfortable saying this out loud, including the relevant details and practicing that. This is something where practicing will really help you improve the delivery. And I'd love to hear if there's particular challenges that you have in the actual answering of questions that I can help you think through. So the ones that I've seen the most often doing interviews, speed. You want to practice because you do not want to go too fast or too slow. And most people, I would say, when they get nervous, go too fast. Most of us will speed up. So practice slowing yourself down if that's you. And then when you do that, you'll also want to keep an eye on the length of your answer. It is based on the interview length, but it is often 2 minutes or less. It's not a ton of time. You don't have time to go into every possible detail. So you need to practice it so that you can get it to a good length where you still include a lot of the key information, but you're not going on for like 7 minutes in a 30-minute interview and they have a bunch of other questions. Tongue twisters. Practicing out loud can help you catch words that are difficult to say out loud. And you might want to just replace it with an easier word if you're tripping over it. If it's something you cannot replace, it's just something you need to get more comfortable and get used to speaking. Recording yourself and then listen back. And I see that in the chat. That is such a great way to do it. And it's hard. I find it hard to listen to myself, but it's a really good practice. The other thing you'll want to notice when you're working on your delivery is avoiding negativity. Like even if you're talking about a conflict, don't dwell on it. Just stick to those facts and what you did and move through it. Enthusiasm. Often you will come across as less enthusiastic if you're nervous or you're on a video screen. So I recommend turning it up a little bit more, not a ton, but just a little bit from where you normally are to sort of compensate for that. And then just know nervousness is normal. Like you can still do well even if you're nervous. It does not prevent you from that. Like you all have very good strategies for like practice and getting sleep. You can still do well when you're nervous. And then I see this question about eye contact. Like that really depends. If you're in person, making occasional eye contact is going to be enough. In video, it's hard to even have that directly. So I would say just being aware to do some of that and practice, maybe with like a little point that you're trying to look at so that you can focus on doing that and still answering the questions, so that you're not just like looking down like this the whole time, if that's a natural tendency. We all have these. Any other questions on improving delivery? I have some last couple things on anticipating challenges and evaluation here. Really the best thing to do is just practice, record it, have someone watch and give you feedback. It's a skill. Interviewing is a skill like anything else. And the only way that you can really improve is to do more answering of questions out loud. I don't see anything in the chat, so I'll move on. Anticipate the challenges. I sort of mentioned this when I mentioned reviewing the job description and thinking like an interviewer, but you want to think through if there's anything that's going to be particularly that's like harder for you to talk about, maybe you're not as comfortable with it or just not as familiar with talking about it. And I'll talk about the ones that most often are challenges for people, and it's answering those really hard questions. So employers like to ask hard questions sometimes. And if you've ever worked with a difficult person, you kind of understand why they're asking a hard question because they don't want to end up with somebody, they didn't ask a question and didn't find out something that wouldn't be a good fit, right? So they want to think through things to really get to know that person as well as someone who's qualified for the role. Hard questions can allow you to shine if you have practiced them and you have thought about them and you're ready. So I'll give two that I think that when I've done these webinars and trainings before, are like the most commonly like feared ones, the ones that people are like, I do not want that question. It would be talking about failure or talking about conflict. These are hard for most people. And those are questions that might be behavioral interview questions. So a question like, tell us about a time when you failed and how did you handle it? Give an example of when you disagreed with a supervisor. What did you do? We had one in the chat that was like, how do you handle a new challenge at work that you've never encountered before? So these are like these are big ones, but failure and conflict, I feel like are especially difficult. So one thing it's helpful to keep in mind is what kind of qualities do you think an employer is looking for, especially if you've ever had a not great work environment, you might be thinking like, what are the positive things they are looking for when they ask a hard question? They want to see that you can learn from your failures, right? That you don't give up, that you take accountability and responsibility if you make a mistake, right? They also want to see that you treat others respectfully, even if you are having a conflict. You're not avoiding the conflict. You're not making it worse. You are, treating people respectfully and asserting what your needs are and just trying to handle it the best way that you can. So these are the kinds of qualities. And if you think about it, it's probably the kind of people you want to work with as well as people who have these qualities. And so tips for good answers. You want to have honest examples that still show your good qualities that you are willing to learn. And you can include that even if they don't specifically ask. If they ask you about a challenge or they ask you about a mistake, I would always include, and here's what I learned from it, and here's what I've done differently, or here's what I would do differently. You can put that positive facing angle on it. That is just really, really helpful for folks to hear from you, that you are self-reflective and that you have learned and that you would be a good person to work. So these are all things I think can be really helpful for you. And then finally, just like a little bit of strategies for evaluation. And this is just my reminder to you. I always want to include this. Interviews are a two-way street. And there's often a point at the end where you can ask your own questions. And I recommend that you do. If you have questions ready, it shows genuine interest. You can have a more unscripted conversation, not around their questions, and you can gather info to evaluate, like, how do I feel about this position? Do I still feel really good about it? And again, it depends on who you're talking to. The hiring manager, a good person to ask about like challenges and opportunities for this work. Your colleagues, you could ask them about the team culture, like what do they like working here? For leaders, it might be more about the mission or vision, but just have some questions, have some more specific ones than these that you want to know. Because again, the purpose of the interview is that both of you, you and the employer, both feel good about this as a possible fit for you so that if they make an offer, you accept. So remember, it's a two-way street. You also can ask them things. Think about what you want to ask them as well. And it can often make a really great last impression at the end of your interview. And here, any last questions that you have. We also have, I think this is the very end of our time here, where we've got a little bit of information about the recording and some evaluations, but you can put a last question in the chat, or I'll put my LinkedIn in the email if you'd like to stay in touch. Thanks all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hopkins. We really appreciate your presentation. Folks, please do enter your questions into the chat. I just popped up a poll with some evaluation questions for all of you to find out a little bit more about your thoughts about today's webinar to help us continue to plan more. I am going to share two final slides while we are concluding. We have one webinar coming up at the end of February about networking, building connections at conferences. And we have three excellent panelists who will be joining us for that. So we do hope that you will join us on February 26th. Please don't forget to register for it. And I also wanted to remind you about our Planetary Career News site. The site has been around for quite some time, but I haven't done as good a job as I'd like to of really highlighting it. We're trying to post different workshops and events for you for early career and for students, internships, fellowships, positions, scholarships, awards, opportunities to participate in different things going on, and other resources for planetary and astrobiology careers. So please do check that page out and let us know if you have things to add. Feel free to reach out to me or to Yolanda. We're at education@lpi.usra.edu. With that being said, we're very thankful that all of you were able to join us and participate today. Any final questions? It looks like there is a question about couple questions coming in the chat really quickly about clarifying on research design interview questions.
Yeah, so I think that would just be about like questions to evaluate sort of your scientific thinking and designing experiments, if that's relevant to the job. Like, if how would you validate what you're doing? What if you had to change your approach, right? So just things to think about. This especially be if you have to have like a research design and plan. how you'd fund that. So it really depends. Like that wouldn't necessarily come up in every kind of interview, but I could see that coming up in a tenure track faculty interview, or maybe like R&D and biotech kind of jobs where that would be part of the work. So yeah. I
Thank
also
you.
see a question about tailoring a pitch to an audience. Yeah, I think that when it's tailoring a pitch, and this is specifically about interviewing as a data science or analyst in tech, like for big tech companies, I think just going back to like not just the skills that you have, but like what is the purpose? Like what do they need them for? Like what's the kind of environment that you'll be working on and what are the goals that they have? And thinking through like how can I demonstrate what I've done and what where it's most transferable, right? So how showing that you understand the context change. And if you're answering a question, being like, here's a past example, but I know that's different, you might also add on to the end. And here's since I understand that your work is different, here's how I might change that. Here's how I could see that being different and what I might do differently to make it more successful for the goals that you have. That can just show your kind of critical thinking skills and being aware of the context.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We really appreciate you. Thank you everyone for joining us. As I noted, this is recorded, and so the recording will be available online. And Dr. Hopkins, if there's other things you want to share in the chat, you are welcome to in terms of profile links or anything else. It's entirely up to you. But it is not hard to find Dr. Bethany Hopkins when you do a search. She pops up. So
Yeah, thanks. I put my LinkedIn in the chat and I'll put it one more time again, just to let you know. I'm happy to stay connected, to follow up. Happy to do that.
thank you all so much. I'm going to